Hello and welcome to my channel, The Orchid Hut. My name is Dana. Thank you for joining me for an orchid video today. When we get to the end of this video, if you enjoyed it or learned something new, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more videos. Hit the notifications bell if you would like to know when I post something new. And as always, a thumbs up is appreciated because it encourages me to keep making more videos. So here we go for today. Today's video is going to be a repot of a Phalaenopsis orchid that I have just fallen in love with. Let me give you a close-up of the bloom. And it has just started to have the blooms where they're wilting just the tiniest bit. And I think this Phalaenopsis bloomed a bit out of season for my area at least. It came from an orchid nursery that was up north, so you know, it probably was just blooming a bit out of cycle. So what I've noticed though in the last couple of weeks is that, you know, it was one of those potted in the little tight flimsy plastic pot in tight sphagnum moss. And I've had this orchid for several months and it was just in spike when it arrived to me. But the very first thing that I did, of course, was remove that tight plastic pot so that I could monitor a bit better how wet this sphagnum moss was staying. So it has been, you know, watered very carefully for the months that I've had it. And it did bloom out, it didn't blast. But just within the last few weeks, I'm noticing again now that these leaves are getting a bit kind of dehydrated, floppy in appearance, and it's just time. It's time to repot this orchid. I want to give it an opportunity to settle into its new pot, develop roots, put on some new growth from the top of the plant. And I do not have expectations that this one will bloom for me next blooming season in my area. But, you know, maybe after that, I might get another bloom spike. I don't want to try and promote secondary bloom spikes on this orchid because it does need time to kind of regain its energy from this bloom cycle and just have a bit of time to develop itself as a plant. And then in a couple of years, I'll hope that it will bloom for me again. Remember, patience is key with growing orchids. So I'm going to go ahead and start taking this apart, taking the clips off. When I cut these spikes, I am going to put them in a vase because, you know, they still look okay for the purposes of a vase. If you happen to hear a strange noise in the background of this video, about 4 houses down, they are sawing through the concrete drainage places along the curb. And before I go any further, let me flame these. I do not know where I used them last time. So they're sawing through the concrete and it is just reverberating through the house. There's kind of like this humming sound, but they've been at this work for several weeks and it lasts all day, and you know, I can't just stop making videos hoping that I can catch a time when they're not going to be making noise sawing through the concrete. It's actually good work that they're doing though. We have had some flooding in the lower part of the neighborhood towards the back, and this work is being done. A bond was passed, so there was money available to do this work to improve our drainage, so I'm all for that. We've never had water in our house. However, some of the houses about 1.5 miles away have had about 6 to 8 inches of water in their house. We tend to have flooding events in this part of Texas. It's usually associated with spring thunderstorms or the hurricanes that we get during hurricane season off of the Gulf. Okay, so those look rather nice in a vase for a little bit longer. I think the pink blush on the petals and sepals is really attractive, and then the contrast of that really, really dark pink lip with a little bit of freckling is just really, really pretty. I don't want to let this orchid go into a more stressful situation and risk losing it. Okay, so after I get the moss off, I will put some cinnamon on those cut spikes. And let's go ahead and get started here and see what we see. One other note about those spikes. You'll notice that this was a double spiked plant. And the orchid itself, is not that large. So, I don't know if that double spike was something that it did on its own or if it's something that the grower encouraged, but you will notice that each of the spikes only had 2 blooms. Yeah, 2 blooms. And for me, I would just prefer, I suppose, to have 1 spike with 4 or 5 blooms on it than 2 spikes that are just kind of so-so. So I don't know if it's this orchid's nature to always send up 2 spikes, but it did this time. So this is the tedious process of picking out this really tight chopped moss. If I feel like it needs a little bit more moisture to come off more easily, I will go and kind of put it under the sink for just a little bit. But it seems to be coming off pretty well. These roots are not as, what I would say, far gone as the previous orchid that was potted this way that I put in new media. And it is not as dehydrated as that one that I did the tea soak on. So I'm on purpose trying to get to this one a bit sooner before it goes downhill even more. The sawing has stopped for the moment anyway. I've been thinking about videos for next year. Well, topics for videos for next year. One of them is definitely going to be an update on my winter resting dendrobiums that have been hanging on the side of the house. They are definitely doing their winter resting thing. So I want to do an update video on that. I also have an idea for some, I would say, budget-friendly orchid hacks. So it's ways to maybe save a little bit of money in the way of orchid supplies, and a few little tricks for addressing little minor issues that you might have with your orchids. So that's another video idea. I am noticing, I think, I'm not 100% sure yet, I think I notice some of my other Phalaenopsis beginning to get indications of spikes. So I'll be sharing those. And usually my Phalaenopsis, you know, spike more like in January-ish. I'll also be doing some more videos on the different sections of dendrobiums. So I posted one the other day about the Phalaenopsis type dendrobiums. And so there are many other, well, at least 5 more types of dendrobiums that I can do a video on. And then I want to do a beginner orchid video on sort of like my tips for starting your orchid hobby, things that might make it a bit easier for you to be successful when you're starting off with your first few plants. I've been doing this now probably like 8 or 9 years, but really I would say seriously for the last 3 or 4 years. And it's amazing what you learn just through experience. I mean, you can read a lot, but until you really experience it yourself, there's really just no better teacher. Okay, so some of this moss is a little bit more stubborn. I think I might go get it wet under the sink. So out of all of those new video topics that I mentioned, if you would be so kind as to leave me a comment about which one you might like to see first, I can always put it at the front of the queue. Okay, I have pulled out a gigantic pile here of this chopped moss. There's something really, really tight at the core of this. I'm not sure if it's a plug or just more tight sphagnum. Looks like it's just more tight sphagnum. Okay, so I'm about to take a break from the videoing here because this is going to take a fairly lengthy rinse under the sink to get the remainder of this moss off. And after I do that rinse at the sink, I'll be back. And as you can see, gigantic mess here to clean up, and then we will talk a little bit more about this orchid and give it a fresh pot and fresh media. Okay, I'll be back. Okay, so back with the orchid from the sink. some water splashed a little bit more than what I like to have happen. So I'm going to dry off the top of it first, and I don't know if you can see on the camera, but some water got into the crown and in between the leaf joints. That is really, you know, not what you want to have happen if you can avoid it. But it's, you know, relatively easy to correct if you take a little bit of time and wick it away with a paper towel. That does at least get the excess out, and then during the day today it will, you know, have an opportunity to finish drying. Oftentimes if you leave excess water down in the leaf joints or in the crown of the plant, that is what begins to initiate crown rot. And you don't want your orchid to rot along the axis, because that is kind of detrimental to your plant and you can actually lose it that way. So let me finish drying that off. And you can see, you know, the paper towel is pretty wet from what I've gotten out of the leaf joints and the top of the axis. Okay, so the next thing here, these cut spikes are wet, so I have a little bit of cinnamon here on a paper towel, and I'm just going to touch those cut spikes with the cinnamon. Okay. And you want to avoid getting cinnamon on the roots because that is a desiccant and you don't want your roots to dry up. And let's take a look at the root system. All in all, you know, it's pretty good shape. A little bit of dead roots here to cut off. I'm noticing here that it has a little bit of a branch root right there, a little tiny nub of a root coming out from an older root. That's a good sign. But these right here are no longer alive, so we'll be cutting those off. There is a little bit of sphagnum moss still hanging on. I will try to pick some of it off as I'm trimming the root system, but it's not critical to get every little tiny piece off. Even in some of these places where the roots are a bit discolored, the roots are still firm. So I only cut the roots if they are papery thin and you can pull on them and you see that tiny little thread. Yeah, that's an indication that it's a goner. But if the root is firm, I tend to leave it, especially on an orchid like this, which is transitioning from one type of media, moss, to another type, which is going to be my Phalaenopsis bark mix. There's another little root tip starting right there. And a lot of people are what I would call a bit more aggressive about trimming the root system, because the theory is that if you leave dead roots in the new potting media, it will cause the new potting media to go off and to deteriorate and become more acidic more quickly, and some of that is true, but I tend to repot my Phalaenopsis orchids every 2 years, or if I see something, you know, going really badly, I'll repot it. And I keep a pretty close eye, so I'm not as worried about putting some roots in the pot that may die or will die. So I tend to maybe be a little bit less aggressive with my root trimming. And unfortunately, during the process of getting the moss out, there was a really nice new root right here that just snapped off. So I think I'm going to cut that back so that it's going to be more above where the bark mixture will be. This one is a little bit damaged right here. You'll see that it snapped a while ago, and really the only thing that's holding it is that thread. So I'm going to go ahead and trim that off. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. Let's go ahead now and talk about the pot and what comes next. I am going to spray this with hydrogen peroxide, but while we're talking about the pot, I'll let it continue drying here for just a few more moments. Okay, so one of my favorite orchid pots. This one is the appropriate size. I've checked ahead of time. The root system, for the most part, fills up this pot. Many of the roots will be near these aeration vents, which is good because I'll be able to keep an eye on them, and they'll be up against the edge of the pot. And I will be using my standard Phalaenopsis bark mix today, but I will be adding just a few extra strands of sphagnum moss because this orchid is transitioning from one type of media to another. And that sphagnum moss will allow me to keep it a little bit more evenly hydrated while it's adjusting. So in the bottom of this pot, I put the last little bit of cork bark that I had, as well as a few large pieces of orchid bark, just to keep the fine particles of the other media from clogging up the bottom of the pot. It's okay to mix the cork and the bark. And let me get my moss. Okay. So we're going to give it a spray with the peroxide. I'm not seeing anything on these orchid roots that would concern me to have to, you know, really overspray or double spray or, you know, saturate every single root. And now I'm just kind of checking for fit here. I think there is room for me to put just the tiniest bit of the mix in the bottom. And this mix has some sphagnum moss in it, but I'm going to just put just a little bit of extra. Okay, then the orchid. And this one, you know, really didn't have any aerial roots per se. So I'm not having to contend with that. I'm going to give it a tap here to let that settle. Another piece or two of the moss. Okay, now what we want to check for is air spaces that are too large. So as we go around and look at the edge of the pot here, I don't really see any air spaces where media has not like fallen down in there. So I'm going to give it just another tap just for good measure. And finish filling it up. I'm only pressing down on the bark just enough to stabilize the plant in the pot. You don't want to press down too much because that ruins the natural air spaces that are in between the bark pieces, and these orchids are epiphytes. They do need air for their roots. Okay, and looking really good. Okay, so I think that is a finished repot for this orchid. Let's have a look at the tag before I replace it. Phalaenopsis Sweety cat. I will be giving it a good watering, and probably putting it either in the bay window or under the grow lights in the back bedroom where the outdoor orchids are. But I think we can call this one done, and I hope to see these leaves perk up just a little bit over the course of the next few weeks, and cross my fingers for blooms probably in about 2 years. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, and thanks so much for watching. See you next time.